I'm delighted to be joined today by James Bloodworth, who's an excellent writer, journalist, and we're here to talk about James's new book, Lost Boys: A Personal Journey to the Manosphere, which some of you might have seen already. It's James. I think it's fair to say it's had a great. I think you've had great publicity for the book so far. It's had rave reviews, which I'm not surprised by. It's an excellent book. It's really interesting. It's a compelling narrative, I think, about a topic that is hugely interesting. This question of the manosphere, more generally, this idea of like why a growing number of young men are kind of searching for identity, meaning, belonging, and often finding it in places that are darker, frankly, than many of us want them to be. And the book really kind of takes us really deeply into that world, this world of I had to learn lots of vocabulary. I knew what the word incel was, but there's crank magnetism and lots of other kind of vocab and phrases and jargon I wasn't used to before, which are all in there. And we meet. I think one of the real strengths of this book is there's a lot of first person reporting in it, a lot of first person reportage, which as a journalist who likes to see that, I find that it's really compelling and it really kind of helps bring the reader along on this journey into the manosphere. And partly, James, as well, I think what comes out a lot in the book, as well as your own experiences in this world. And I guess, we've got a good bit of time to talk about this. I want people to put questions into the chat as well. We'll have a Q&A towards the end of this. But I wanted to really start the book. I think we will talk a lot about politics, I'd say, over the next hour as well. We'll talk about nationalism, we'll talk about white nationalism, we'll talk about a lot of those sort of things and what's driving some of this and the role of the manosphere in it. But I think I wanted to start where probably a lot of your conversation about this book have started, which is, how did you come to this subject, and what was your own story, your own kind of journey into the manosphere many years ago?
Okay, thanks for having me, first of all, Peter, and thanks for the very nice introduction and the things you said about the book. I mean, I first discovered the manosphere not like before I was a journalist, as a civilian, quote unquote, or whatever, in 2005. So it would have been, but it wasn't really called the manosphere then. It was just kind of it was just the pickup artist community, which I'd come home from college one day. I'd basically had a period of my life at that age where I was very socially awkward, stayed in the house a lot, wasn't in education or training. It's like worked part time in a petrol station, and just kind of didn't go out a lot. My social skills kind of atrophied. I lost kind of a lot of confidence, and was smoking too much weed and things like this that also were not conducive to having necessarily a good social life. And I thought, oh, if I go to college, as well as getting some grades, that will just kind of fix my problem. I went to college and I still didn't like. I still was no closer to having like a girlfriend or really improving my social skills. So I had friends at college, but I was still a bit isolated. There was someone I liked. Didn't know how to like ask someone out as maybe as I don't know if that is unusual really, but it was. I was just kind of did not know what to do in those kind of situations. And so I went home one day after college, Googled. I think it was something like how to ask a girl out or how to get a girlfriend or something. I don't remember the exact words, and kind of discovered this forum where these guru figures like promised to have all the answers, and then it became kind of a big thing with a big-ish thing in the culture with Neil Strauss's book, The Game. Kind of people started to hear about it, and he kind of, it wasn't really an undercover expose. He was sort of a promoter of the material as well in many ways. Like he started to sell his own courses and stuff. And it was I kind of dabbled it like, some conversation starters or, some very prosaic advice. I thought, this is actually kind of useful. And so I started to dabble in that stuff for a few months and stuff. But then over time, when I went to university, I just kind of, the more time you spend in it, the more you see the effect it has on some of the guys in that industry and stuff. Obviously, the women as well, but you see the way that men become like very salesy, very manipulative, and then kind of that made me kind of try and interrogate my own relationship with that stuff, because I tried to overlook the objectifying, misogynist aspect of it. Like, I was kind of arrogant enough to think, I can just take the bits which I can just take these lines which kind of seem quite good as openers and stuff and ignore all that stuff. But the more you kind of swim in those waters, the more you're kind of marinated in that kind of sexist, misogynistic kind of worldview and essentialist view of men and women and all this stuff. So that was kind of how I first found the Manosphere. And then 2018, I kind of went back into when it was suggested to me during a conversation with my editor. I suggested writing a book about it, but I didn't really want to do the book because I was embarrassed about the stuff from 2005, 2006. I didn't really want to confront that, and I still feel, I don't know, I'm not really embarrassed. I don't really care now. It's like 20 years on, but it's still kind of, if I talk about it in detail or even writing about it, that was really hard to write about because it's like, this is so cringeworthy, but it really did happen. I like that.
Yeah, I think that's the thing that really struck me. Like the book opens in Leicester Square in 2006, so 20 years ago, and you're there, and I think that honesty about your own experiences as a young man and what might have brought you into that kind of place. But there's a couple of things, and you're there with this kind of, you're basically a kind of pickup artist school, and there's other people who are kind of like it's an aggressively masculine environment. It's also an environment like lots of people would be familiar with from if you go into a club, into these sort of situations, you can see, I think a lot of young men at almost any time would have been part, would know people who might have been in that sort of environment. It's a kind of aggressively masculine environment. What's really striking actually is how you're basically being taught that the way you are isn't good enough. There's a great line actually about where it said like people are constantly telling you to like be yourself, and what they mean is to be attractive. And I think there's something kind of underlying there as well about how these are people who are trying to change how they are or who they are to fit something else.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think the industry itself kind of, on the one hand, it's like a sales funnel. So on the one hand, it's not just you already feel insecure, it's they make you feel insecure or they make you feel more insecure. And then they kind of swoop in with the expensive course that purports to fix you. But they also operated the pickup artists, and I think the Manosphere generally in a slightly different way. They operated in this kind of space between in this kind of chasm of like mainstream hypocrisy, where so on the one hand it would be we kind of do live in like a lookist society that's very kind of and got more superficial with things like dating apps and everything through screens, and that's true from everything from like popular culture to politics, even like being telegenic is kind of the big thing really now, and of course to dating and how to be attractive, how to be confident. Even is it like you need to kind of learn to be at least a little bit assertive. That was kind of what I kind of found out, and it's like you hear those kind of grains of truth from these people telling you this, the people who give you that unvarnished kind of demolition of your kind of self-esteem in some ways, and some of it was actually needed. Like sometimes you do actually need to use mouthwash before you go out to the club or something. Sometimes you do need to be told that your fashion sense is shit, and you do need to actually be a bit more assertive. You can't just wait for someone else to take the initiative. And like those grains of truth that kind of friends and loved ones and whatever were kind of too kind to kind of really tell you in that unvarnished way. That kind of draws you in, I think, partly. And then you see these people as like guru figures, and then you think, well, they've kind of they're right. They seem to be right about this one thing, or they seem to be helping me with this one thing. So I'm going to kind of go all in and listen. They're going to be my role models now, and I'm going to kind of go all in and listen to them. And that's why I think there was a lot of like hero worship in that environment of these guru figures. And I think even the Manosphere now, where it's different kinds of figures, work like darker individuals like Andrew Tate, they have even a stronger hold on. They can do on younger boys, teenage boys especially, because they can also project the lifestyle as well through video based social media, which wasn't around when I was at least not really in MySpace, I guess. But it wasn't anything like it is now, where you can make your kind of charismatic confidence man sales pitch in front of the bevy of like women in bikinis, or the hired car, or the hired mansion, or the infinity pool, or whatever. And it's kind of it's easier for them to sell that now, whereas I was kind of spared that in many ways.
Yeah, that's actually where I was going to go with this. Like, it's 2006, you're in Leicester Square. You kind of end up slightly disgusted by the whole scene. You kind of disgusted, but also it doesn't really work for you, drift away. That feels like that wouldn't happen now. You know, like, or it would be much harder for it to happen. Like your experience was actually very much an IRL and in real life experience, and you kind of picked that a bit through the book. Do you want to talk about that? Like what the you of then might see if they were now?
Yeah, I think the most obvious starting point with how it's different now would be just like the algorithmic thing kind of pulling you further into like more and more extreme stuff, or whatever will keep your eyeballs glued to the social media, so that then they can sell more advertising. Basically, it's pretty straightforward. Um, and so, when I started researching the book, within a very short period of time, I'd watched a few Jordan Peterson videos, some kind of random like Manosphere people, and then my whole timeline is kind of like taken over by this kind of stuff. And then there's always like one or two videos there which are a bit darker, or a bit more like sweeping in their condemnation, or a bit more it's no longer just conversations about men's like lonely men and stuff. It's now talking about conversations about lonely men, and that's the fault of feminism and the left, and Western civilization decline because of always somewhere in there would be, about gender, breakdown of rigid gender norms and stuff. So that's really different. I mean, there's stats to back this up. So there's a stat in the book I used in 2024. An Australian study found that someone watching a video of Jordan Peterson on Instagram would be shown, a teenage boy would be shown a video of Andrew Tate within an hour, and if they viewed that, it was there was a high chance that their timeline would then be mostly Andrew Tate if they watch that one video. It's yeah. I mean, it's like an engagement strategy on the part of the algorithms. That's the main thing, really. And the whole culture's got more. There are just more people in the subculture because people just worked out different grifts. So the grift in the late 2000s after Neil Strauss's book was, calling yourself like a seduction guru. You take men to a nightclub, and it's really easy to just like point at people and be like, "Go approach this person." Go approach. It's not like you're really doing that much, but they create this guru image around themselves.
And sorry to interrupt, but and quite huge fees people are paying for it too was one thing that jumped out at me as well. People are paying like $3,000, frankly, to be brought to a nightclub and have
Yeah,
someone
it's
point women at them.
thousands, and it's got more expensive as well because it's now kind of more of a. Back then, it would be kind of so there's a kind of, it's a very narrow focus to it, like learning how to go out to a club and like chat someone up or something, or that was kind of the focus of that. But now it's like this more all encompassing thing, like be the alpha male, so get rich, start a business, usually a generic drop shipping business, but and also have these kind of create this social media content where you're kind of surrounded by this ostentatious lifestyle, and also just it's more political. So now there's that kind of political element to it much stronger, where it's like MAGA and all of that was really like a part of a lot of that stuff. It kind of blurs. They're all like the more you go towards like the red pill, it's just like full MAGA. It's hard to like differentiate really a lot of that stuff. It's so intertwined.
I guess that was something I will talk about the MAGA side in a sec, but just again, kind of just to keep on the information ecosystem side of it. It does feel also like back to 2020, 2006 when you were in this space to now, the extent to which our information ecosystem has changed and frankly been, as you've seen these kind of influencers, these kind of pseudo gurus become huge parts, the Andrew Tate's this world of the information ecosystem, like humongous amounts of video watches, etc. Like, how important do you think that has been for the kind of the rise of the manosphere of this kind of this sort of online world?
Yeah, I mean it's hugely it's a huge part of it. So I mean, there's a lot of that stuff ties into during the 2010s. You get YouTube. I think it's 2010. Instagram, Tinder. The way kind of social media kind of becomes much more video visual based. Much more. It's much more kind of conducive to those kind of telegenic, charismatic people to sit in front of a swimming pool with like a ripped physique or something and make you feel small and insignificant. I mean, there's that's not just a gendered point really, because that's obviously something that women have experienced, and there's lots of stats on Instagram making teenage girls feel really really shit about themselves. often to influence them in some way to buy something or to fix them or whatever. But it's the same thing kind of started to kind of, they use social media a lot more effectively, some of these grifters, uh, to get through to that teenage boy male audience. And you see also the rise of these influencers, like Dan Bilzerian is probably I'd say the most pertinent example, the most relevant example, who he kind of his whole thing is being Instagram famous by just being surrounded by women as these kind of trophies as part of the lifestyle. And that he's kind of very useful. He proves very useful to the manosphere, because then they use people like that as an example, as like the lodestone of society is heading to this place because of feminism, where women are only interested in these rich buff guys. The 80-20 rule. So 80% of women are pursuing, well, all women basically are pursuing 20% of men, leaving 80% of men just kind of this sort of flotsam of no hopers and stuff. And so they would point at that and then do their sales pitch and say, this is you don't want to be one of the surplus men. You look at the world we're moving to today. All of these elite men are going to be hooking up with all the women and stuff. If you don't buy my course, you're basically screwed. And there's a lot of that. That really changed the game. That social media aspect to it. So the same guys who would be in the past selling their kind of magic beans or get rich quick schemes in the back pages of some men's magazine or like a pornographic magazine or Reader's Digest, I don't know, whatever. They would be now. They have this way to just kind of circumvent socialization and go straight to like cell phones and stuff, and also show like the proof is in the pudding. Look, the visuals don't lie. Like, I'm in this kind of bubble of wealth and women and stuff, and all of these status objects attached to masculinity. So that's kind of a huge part of that, and the incel movement, the involuntary celibate movement, the guys who you saw sometimes over the 2010s involved in some of the most high profile, like horrific, violent incidents. They come about, but they come about partly as a reaction to the pickup community, like guys who were ripped off by these pickup hucksters and whatever. They form their own community, but they don't slough off any of the misogyny. They're still misogynist, but they form this community. They start to like moan about the pickup guys and call them scammers and like mock them and stuff, and that ends up basically that dark energy ends up being turned back on women.
Well, it's quite striking, actually, and in some ways, that's this kind of what runs through your book. I feel is the theme of reaction. This
Yeah.
idea, like there's different and reactionary forces, and there's a great quote in the book about actually, and it actually comes from the time of fascism, but fascism as a reactionary response to a revolution that hadn't happened, and that feels like an element of this too that runs through the book. Like there's a kind of attack on feminism in particular, and like kind of gender ideology, etc. This sense, which you've actually seen in a lot of American politics, this sense that like the left has won some huge battle, and this is what the world looks like now. And could you talk through that a bit, because that does feel, at least to me, that was something that kind of I came away thinking about a lot. This idea of reactions to something that, in some respects, really hasn't happened, or at least beyond kind of corporate DEI kind of things, not something that's changed to a huge degree from from 10 or 15 years ago.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's partly. So it's one thing I didn't touch on, and I think one thing people often don't touch on when we talk about the 2010s is like we see the technological change, but I don't know. Sometimes we're apt to forget. I think that, well, actually, the 2010s, at least a huge part of it, was characterized by, like here in Britain at least, austerity. There's this kind of crisis of legitimacy among politicians, among kind of, for want of a better cliche, like neoliberalism. That this kind of model, like how does it justify itself? How does it kind of authorize that kind of exploitative model in some ways? And it's kind of the manosphere in some ways runs parallel to like the populist stuff, where one way to justify its continued kind of existence in some ways is to then point at women and minorities and say, your life hasn't maybe, to a guy, your life hasn't maybe turned out how you want it to because they're holding all the treasure, or because you can't really be a man anymore, and you don't have that status relationship anymore to some of those groups. So in the men's status relative to women has changed. So you may have had a lowly position in the economic hierarchy in the past or something, but at least in your home you could be like an oligarch, a feudal lord over your family. I mean, that's kind of part of that patriarchal model. You had status over over women and your family, and you also see that kind of that sales pitch done with ethnic minority groups. You see that kind of pitch to people that it's not really fixing the problem. It's kind of, I mean, this is quite a familiar left wing argument. You see as like kind of scapegoating. Well, these people are really why you should be angry with these people, not with the people who are responsible for a lot of the mess we find ourselves in. So there's a huge part of that. I think that's kind of what I would want to highlight as like the main draw of that stuff, because like I think sometimes people say during these conversations, they say to me, "Oh well, what about like all the like left, like the ultra left like craziness of this?" Is like what they will say to me. What about all this ultra left craziness on like Twitter during the, say, I know, late 2010s or something, where it's like people tweeting "kill all men" and stuff like this. I mean, I think it's like blaming that stuff is like missing the wood for the trees. It's like, yeah, I think that stuff's not good messaging. It's not helpful to just swing over some like really naive, politically naive person who's just like logs on and is like, oh, I kind of agree with feminists about this stuff and not this stuff, but then it's like, oh, kill all men. It's like, this is just like not good messaging. But it's such a small fry thing, I think, compared to kind of this backlash. There's this bigger backlash against just various forms of equality, equal rights. And there's kind of this opportunity presented by this economic kind of stagnation and the fact that some guy doesn't have a girlfriend maybe has more to do with the fact that he still lives with his parents when he's like in his 30s or something. But there's, these guys come along and say, well, no, it's really because feminism has kind of brainwashed these women into just pursuing the chads and the alpha males on dating apps. So, like, if you don't believe me, look at Dan Bilzerian and Andrew Tate. They constantly hammer this message, and the ground is like more fertile for that, basically, since the recession and since a bunch of stuff that's happened since 2008, 2009, I would say.
I think what's interesting in your book as well, you do pick out moments like that, like 2008, 2009, like moments where things happen. And you kind of interrogate them a bit. But one that struck me actually was Gamergate.
Yeah.
And I was going to ask you to talk through Gamergate a little bit, and I was going to also preface that with, there's a great quote from Steve Bannon, which I hadn't heard from him before, about Gamergate. And he says, they came in through Gamergate or whatever, and then they got turned on to politics and Trump. And I guess, could you just unpack Gamergate a bit, but also it's what it was as a thing, but also this kind of, for someone like Steve Bannon to say something like that, the way it kind of spread into politics and the kind of populist right.
Yes, I mean, Gamergate really, I mean, has its origins on like forums like Reddit and 4chan, and there was kind of this loser culture. As one of the former incels I interviewed in my book, I thought it was a very good like phrase for it. There was this loser culture that incels kind of went, or not just incels, but these forums where people kind of would, maybe they didn't have much like status. They were generally like low status teenage boys and stuff, and they use like racism, sexism, trolling, homophobia as this kind of way to bond, like a locker room type experience. But it just got very dark and it became an echo chamber. And there was also all of that kind of irony and trolling stuff that then kind of the alt-right at the time and the far right kind of started to use more, where they dealt with political correctness of the 90s and the 2000s and what now is called like woke. They dealt with that stuff by saying things in a way that you couldn't always tell whether it was serious or not. And if you did take it serious, that made you look kind of silly and uptight and pompous for, oh, why are you taking it seriously? It's just a joke. So that loser culture was there for a while, like that forum culture. And Bannon and Milo Yiannopoulos and some of these kind of, this vanguard of just, and people like Casey Hopkins, that kind of figure, they kind of figured out that was there on these forums, and you could kind of harness those kind of bigotries and stuff, and turn them on to like bring them into the mainstream and kind of turn that kind of fire hose against things that bothered them. Like, there was Gamergate was around computer games and this push for more women, more white men to take up less space in computer games, whether that's through more diverse characters, whether that's through just kind of people calling out misogyny on some of the gaming forums and platforms and whatnot. And that kind of
and then emerged from it. Basically started. It was a kind of it was one guy in the gaming
Yeah,
community accusing his partner of having cheated on him, effectively.
yeah. There was the individuals involved, which was kind of there was already this backlash against uh, more women and ethnic minorities in video games and films as well. But then there was the kind of the lightning rod, as it were, would be there was this female gamer who had made a game could create a game for people with depression quest, and her ex-boyfriend wrote an angry letter saying that she was a hypocrite because she'd been espousing all this kind of social justice warrior stuff, while at the same time he accused her of sleeping with other magazine writers for good positive reviews. And it was just kind of the trolls and stuff jumped on it as an example of progressive hypocrisy, like espousing all of these like high ideals while actually making these grubby like sexual deals behind the scenes just to get coverage for your thing. And it was just kind of they jumped on that, and it became this kind of lightning rod. And loads of female journalists who wrote about this issue got like trolled. Female gamers just like viciously trolled, like rape threats and whatnot. And yeah, there were people like Milo, Steve Bannon, very openly said, that this can be channeled into politics, and it sort of was. I wouldn't say it was the base, but it was part of that online culture, like Pepe the Frog, and also that the style of humor that then was adopted by lots of the right wing provocateurs, like the trolling and use of irony to cover up, to kind of bamboozle your opponents in some ways, like discombobulate your opponents. Like, are they serious? Are they not? What's this symbol mean? And also cause overreach. So cause people to freak out about some like symbol, some like emoji or something, to freak out, and then they would then use that to say, look, this is just a hysterical extreme radical left. We're just joking around, And then it was all fed into that stuff. And also your space as a man is threatened by these groups who think you're just toxic for playing computer games, or I know, going to the gym or something later. Not that a lot of the troll guys went to the gym necessarily, but yeah, just you're just being a man is under threat.
And
Being
I
a
think,
white as well.
and I think it's fascinating that kind of that moment was the alt-right. Even the phrase alt-right is kind of like imbued with a kind of like an element of playfulness, actually. That's quite, it is this orientation. The Pepe the Frog. I remember the first time I saw Pepe the Frog in real life was in a video. I was actually in an Apple store in Pittsburgh in Pennsylvania. I was covering the 2016 general presidential election. I needed to get something for my phone, and it was someone had stuck it on a MacBook, and it was just in the shop, and it was exactly this kind of like, oh, we're just kind of joking here. And I guess what strikes me reading your book as well is you can start to see how that started. This kind of like a kind of manosphere adjacent jokiness, the alt-right sort of thing, starts to really intersect and cross over with white nationalism. Frankly, that starts to become much more of a theme as your book goes on, as time goes on. Really, 'cause your book is quite chronological. As time goes on, we start to see this morphing more and more into quite an overt white nationalism.
Yeah, there's a lot of that stuff. I mean, there's that kind of biological essentialism that comes out of the, like, even the pickup guys. It's like they believe these very like rigid. They have this very rigid view of men and women as being this, like that book Men Are From Mars, Women Are From Venus, all this kind of stuff, and like Evo Psych, like pseudo wisdom. And you see kind of the red pill really leans into that stuff. So there's no veneer that about socialization anymore. Only when it's gay people, who apparently that's a choice, but everything else, like men and women, is like biologically determined, like social Darwinism. And it doesn't take long when people are swimming in those waters to kind of become race realists, and to start to at least cross over with those people. And you see some of those similar threads about how we need to protect our women from different races and stuff, and it's very kind of the boundary very quickly blurs with that, because you did meet people in those spaces. You have like the Black Manosphere. It's a bit like when you have nationalist movements. Sometimes it seems odd to think that they do collaborate internationally, seeing as they often like hate each other and see each other as completely kind of in their own spaces. But you did see that type of collaboration between people who would You know, one group thinks that like these group people in the black manosphere are actually basically genetically inferior, but they'll still collaborate and with a shared kind of hatred of women. So yeah, you did see that, and also anti-Semitism, because that was kind of a thing that has begun to unite some of the more politicized red pill people. I mean, it's always obviously been there on the radical right and far right, but you see this kind of like as an explanatory framework. You see people who already believe in certain conspiracy theories, so they're kind of prone to trying to square the circle. They have to kind of fish for more conspiracy theories because their own don't really add up. So they believe women control the world, but women are also fickle and emotional and basically stupid. And then they also need to explain why, you know, why society languishes under the boot of feminism. Like, how can those things both be true? So then a lot more I started to hear about in the Manosphere how women are basically marionettes, like controlled behind the scenes by these shadowy forces. And then you just get these guys like sprinkling that in about, oh, the Jews or the Jays they would talk about. And it's just kind of, a lot of these guys aren't reading very, not to be too condescending, but a lot of these guys aren't really reading widely and deeply and about the history of some of these movements. So they'll just scout around and in some of these spaces, and they'll pick up like someone there who has done some more work, like a Steve Bannon type figure who has read Julius Evola or whatever. Will kind of feed them these kind of texts that purport to explain why society is being feminized, why the LGBT movement is out of control, and like why, you know, teachers are trying to trans your kids, or why like these purple-haired leftists are basically ruining your chance of ever getting married and having a family and stuff. They want to take away your family and destroy the family and all this stuff. And you know, then that goes into, well, who's the real behind the scenes? Like, you've seen Dan Bilzerian and Andrew Tate dabble in these kind of openly like anti-Semitic themes. Bilzerian especially is like Holocaust denial now, but it's quite prevalent. I was at conferences where this stuff was kind of thrown out there, like the Jays behind the scenes and stuff, and it's you know, what's ostensibly a self-help, making you a better man and stuff, and this stuff is like there. I never encountered that really for all its kind of misogyny. I never really encountered any of that stuff back in the early like pickup stuff, like from like Neil Strauss and Mystery were not talking about that kind of thing.
It's interesting. You mentioned Julius Evola there. I'd like to pick up again, actually, because and the story of Lyndon Mloud, which is a big chunk of the book, and I think this is a man who wrote like basically self-published novels that were, and then increasingly became extremist and ended up killing a number of people. What I found, I might get you to unpack his story, but also to bring it, Evola comes in there again, in this sense of like people who were kind of marginalized becoming increasingly radicalized in their politics, very extreme neo-Nazi politics and all of that. So just explain to us a little bit about that story and how it keys into what we're seeing.
Yeah, so Lyndon Mloud was someone who'd basically been like Manosphere adjacent in the late 2010s and then early 2020 basically. He was someone who'd written these dystopian novels, very violent novels called Sanction, within which he kind of laid out these murders that the fictional character was supposedly going to commit. And there was a lot of Manosphere themes in it. Like Jordan Peterson was cited, I think 15 times or something. There's like he uses all the terminology like alpha males, beta males, but there's also that kind of fascistic spin on that stuff. Even more overtly, where it's kind of, you've got some like Nazi symbols on the cover of the book. You have like slightly more esoteric symbols, not like the swastika. You have kind of that, it's leaning into that tribal masculinity, that esoteric fascism, which is a bit more niche, which again can fly under the radar a bit more. There's a good quote in my book from an anti-fascist who was talking about that stuff, and it's like it flies under the radar in a way that some buffoon with a swastika or doing a salute or whatever is like that. People know what, like Elon Musk, apart from Elon Musk, people like know what that is, but these guys kind of doing this tribal thing, going out to the woods, like yodeling, standing around fires, in black metal, like jackets and stuff. There's all that kind of culture that a lot of people didn't really understand. And yeah, some people in the Manosphere didn't understand it, but some did, and some just ignored it. Some kind of leaned into it themselves. but a lot of them just like this kind of warrior masculinity he was espousing. And he saw himself as like this alpha male who'd been like warrior male who was being held down by this feminized society and stuff. And he thought of himself, yeah, as this kind of elite alpha male. And but he was just completely driven mad by the fact that people didn't weren't subservient to him in the way that he believed they should be. So women didn't bow down to him. He didn't have like a harem of sexual partners like he believed someone like him. It was this kind of solipsism, but also it was fed by this. So you can say people in the Manosphere ultimately said, because he went on to commit mass murder in December 2021. He went on a shooting spree in Denver, Colorado, and killed some like former associates of his who he thought had wronged him, and also killed just like random people. And the Manosphere kind of tried to wash their hands of it and say that he was just kind of this crazy lone wolf, like as they do in those situations. But he was very much like swimming in the Manosphere for a long time before, was invited on some of these big podcasts, was invited to speak at the big Manosphere conference in Orlando that I attended another time for the book. He was very much like bound up in this world. He just kind of, and there were events where I was at where people were kind of pontificating about civil war, like the next American Civil War, and we need to kind of take action. And he kind of just did what some of those people were saying, and yeah, it very was this like we need to. It's like you need to have this cataclysmic event, and you need to create this cataclysmic event, like accelerationism, to accelerate the demise of liberal democracy and bring about kind of a situation where fascists can kind of ascend power and kind of crush the weak and the weaklings and failures have taken over in liberal democracy. We need to kind of restore tradition and hierarchy and all of that stuff. And it sounds super like far-fetched, but this is what he believed, and this is why he went, at least partly why he went on the shooting spree. And the thread from that to the Manosphere is I think I've traced it quite well in the book. It's not that far.
No, it's not at all. It's really quite striking, and you can see actually, like, and he's online actually becoming. You can, you trace him becoming more and more radicalized online and exhibiting more and more radicalization behavior online, and it's just kind of sitting there. Really, frankly, this is somebody who's making pretty clear, I want to commit violence. I want to do these things, and there's one of the other shocking things is that it's just sitting there. Frankly, this is somebody saying this in plain sight, and who then goes on to go on a mass murder spree, which clearly on some level could have been stopped, but wasn't.
Yeah, and there's with this stuff, there's someone like that. There were people who whistle blew about him. So there was a German guy, Andre Thiel, who was in his in a Telegram group because he was interested in the book, and he actually approached the authorities. No one from the Manosphere did. He was kind of I don't really know his deal, but he wasn't a Manosphere. He wasn't into the Manosphere, and he approached the authorities and he said, he'd never met someone. He thought this was a threat. Thought this guy was a threat. He thought he was kind of going to embark on some vigilante, like right wing violence, like start a war on the United States, because he was saying that stuff. And Thiel would later say, after the crimes, after the shootings, that he never met someone who hated women so much. And the thing is that the Manosphere didn't notice that, perhaps because they kind of hold many of those essentially the same views about women, and so he wasn't seen as this kind of like imminent threat to go on and commit mass murder, even though he was threatening to like take flamethrowers and start like attacking government buildings and this stuff. Even though he had a book which the strapline of which was "War is coming," even though he basically prophesized his own actions with a character in the book who almost had an identical name to his own. I mean, it was kind of there in plain sight. And on the one hand, some people, I would say, the best faith, the good faith explanation for why some people ignored it is because there are so many grifters in that space who talk up this kind of warrior creed and warrior alpha male masculinity and are just kind of shit posters and braggarts. And so it's just like, oh, he's just another one of those. But there's also the sense that type of talk is fairly common. This idea that increasingly in the red pill spaces that society has been kind of taken over by drag queen story hour or whatever, just all this kind of cultural stuff that they say is just kind of trying to destroy masculinity and the real high status elite of alpha males. The hierarchy has been kind of washed away by that, and we need to kind of fight back. That's kind of what they say, yeah.
It's striking as well, this idea of accelerationist, like people wanting this idea, like they're willingly and trying to destroy what we might call liberal democracy, or the kind of the tenets of society, to kind of get to accelerate to the next space. And it's something actually that's joined a lot of the conversations we've had recently on Democracy for Sale. We spoke this week to Anne Applebaum, who was talking about the kind of groups that are involved behind in the MAGA right. The techno authoritarians, the Christian nationalists, the traditional MAGA. We spoke to Amy Westerveld recently as well, who's done a lot of work on the network state and looking at like the kind of Peter Thiels of this world. And that's what's kind of what struck me reading your book as well, is that these people have become, like, we would have been kind of, they now see part of themselves in a major political project that's happening in the United States, but also in other parts of the world too. Like, these are not people in some respects who are fringe. These are people who would see themselves reflected actually in dominant or major, at least, political parties that we're seeing in many countries.
Yeah, definitely. And it kind of, there was sometimes I wonder with some of these people, with some of these figures. So Jordan Peterson is someone who emerged in 2018, more of a self-help. He did have a quite reductionist view of men and women then, like gender, sex, but he was also more of a self-helpy guy. He wasn't really. He talked about Nazism, about Soviet totalitarianism, about those kind of things, but it was kind of, he wasn't just always talking about the radical left like all the time and making out that, even like a milquetoast social democrat like Keir Starmer was about to turn Britain into a Venezuela, or that Kamala Harris was a threat to democracy, and all this kind of weird stuff, and the COVID vaccine conspiracy stuff. And with someone like that, I wonder if, did he always have these cranky views, and he was just better at he felt that he was in an environment, in a political climate, social climate, where he had to keep those under wraps a bit more? Or did he kind of become radicalized by social media, audience capture, algorithms, all of this stuff? And it's like, I think it can be both, and it's sort of impossible to discern that stuff. But there's definitely a case of some of I think the hyper identity politics of the 2010s. There was a veneer to some of that stuff of, we're making these like great changes to society, and not just in 2010s, but even like the 90s to 2000s. Like, oh, we've fixed some of these problems because we've tweaked vocabularies and stuff, or we've kind of you have these very kind of, you have like Lockheed Martin with the pride flag or something, or just like a silly example, but just you have this kind of very elite identity politics, which is, oh, we fixed this problem, but it's not really doing the political education work on the grassroots level. So it's very easy when the infrastructure of social media changes, like Musk buys Twitter, for that stuff to just burst back into the forum culture. It hasn't really been addressed properly. It's very this superficial tackling racism, misogyny, and that stuff in a very superficial way. There's not really any political education about where these ideas come from, what these ideas are used to rationalize, like your own situation. The same way, like scientific racism. Why did that emerge? Once you learn about that, it becomes it becomes a lot more easy to see why that's a phenomenon. Why that exists as a phenomenon. Who benefited from that? There was not any of that really education, or not enough. And so I think that kind of edifice of elite identity politics crumbles quite quickly, and you see these kind of forum cultures where it's just open season on women and minorities, just kind of burst through into the mainstream again, and then you have these oligarchs buying up the infrastructure and leaning into that themselves, and it's just there, and it's just there again, and this sewer that kind of it was obviously, when I was growing up in the 90s, it was like more misogynistic in many ways, more racist in many ways, but then there's also, as time passes, there's much more kind of a lid on it. It's much more like, oh, you can't say this stuff in respectable company anymore, and like, it's just, that's not doing the work, but it's still kind of, but it feels like it's kind of, that's just kind of broken down. It's all just coming back up. So that's kind of fed into the rise of some of these influences.
There's a comment there to read from Slugger Confidential. Spot on, James. There's a shift from focused political action to language and rights talk. And I'd actually just encourage people to post any questions they have in the comments too, because we will go to questions shortly too. But yeah, I think it's a really interesting. And one of the things that also struck me is, if you look now, we saw it with Trump, but it's not just a Trump phenomenon. The split now between men and women in terms of voting, it looks to be quite real, especially amongst younger people. Like John Byrne Murdoch has done work with this, the FT. We're seeing, you're seeing younger men voting more to the right, younger women voting more to the left. Like, how much of that how much of that do you think is real? How much of that comes out of this manosphere world, and not just people who are in it, but that kind of, as you say, like the kind of veneer that's gone from the kind of elite level talk on equality, as that disappears, these kind of conversations, people like Jordan Peterson become very, very significant. They become people, as your book narrates very well, where lots of people are repeating talking points from these places. Is that part of why we're seeing this kind of divergence between men and women when it comes to political engagement?
Yeah, I mean, as well, if you look at the education and class level of some of the men who fill those movements, it tends to be, similar to the populist movement sometimes here in the UK with and Brexit, and that way you do have, it's not predominant, like Brexit isn't like a predominantly white, lower middle class, working class thing, but there's kind of that, it's interesting because you kind of expected a certain type of, like Farage type character to support it, like a person who thinks immigration is the result of all the problems in the country. But then you almost see people voting against their own interests in terms of at least material interests. And that's what's interesting sometimes about those movements. And MAGA is obviously a classic example of that. And Richard Reeves, the academic, made a good point following the US election last year that the Democrats had a much better offering for young men and young women, but they didn't really talk about it that much. Whereas the Republicans pitched to young men all the time, working class young men, lower middle class young men, and had a shit offering to them. But it's like a vibe based, aesthetic based economy where you have some of these guys, like people I've met who supported like Bernie Sanders or been Democrat, like older people like Obama, less so Hillary Clinton, which maybe that speaks to that unaddressed like misogyny there. But who would then were like Trump supporters and had just gone into that ecosystem more because via Joe Rogan often slowly, because it was just this space where you didn't feel like someone was looking down on you because you like to do a bench press or something. Like it's these kind of aesthetic choices, and you see that with class. A lot of it ties into class, like really, where you have people gravitating to some of these podcasts and places where they don't necessarily have an elite formal education. They are more like autodidactic individuals who but still are interested, still are curious about the world. And you have this someone who's open to talking about that without using all of the jargon, without talking down to you. And again, where it feels like you could be in that space, you could theoretically be friends with some of those types of people. They're like recognizable people from your kind of social group or whatever. In a way that I think, as the left like retreats more into academia and as the left retreats more into theory and vocabulary and some of those things, it kind of creates this. And even like someone like Jordan Peterson is in some ways he's an elite backlash figure, but he's also a countercultural figure in that he tells those guys that they haven't won the lottery just because they're born a guy. That in a culture which is all about instant gratification and consumerism and stuff, he was telling them, actually, you need to feel bad. You need to do things that are taxing and hard and make you feel bad for a while to get some kind of positive result. That kind of father figure type thing that actually, the path of least resistance is not necessarily good for you. Like turn off the stimulation, the computer games, all this stuff. And people would do that and they would pursue something. Say they went to the gym, say they start a weightlifting program. They do it and it's horrible at first. Like when you do that stuff, it's not very nice. It's like very unpleasant and not enjoyable. But then if you do it for a bit of time, there's this profound sense of satisfaction of achieving something. And if you haven't had that before, it can be like almost euphoric. And to hear someone saying that, then they start these guys like this kind of guru figure. If they don't have someone in their lives saying that, like a father, it doesn't have to be a father, but just this kind of authority figure in some ways, this wise or seemingly wise figure, that was part of that appeal, this kind of countercultural thing that isn't all that countercultural, but really feels countercultural in this like consumer capitalist society where you're supposed to just kind of lean into what feels emotionally good.
Yeah, one of the things I found myself coming away from the book thinking about was like, what is there a way to offer young men meaning and purpose without this kind of reactionary baggage? You've been in this space. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, the problem is a lot of that stuff starts from like very unglamorous, sort of boring, not necessarily boring, but some boring stuff on like a grassroots level, and that realm has been like hollowed out. So I mean, my last book, Hired, I looked at some of those communities where you have these kind of institutional affiliations during the 20th century around like industrialized economies. And this is like specifically men. I mean, I'm not saying, I don't want to romanticize that period of time, but you have these kind of institutional affiliations, trade unions, social clubs, religious organizations like churches, pubs. You have more public spaces. You have this kind of local democracy in the sense that you have a functioning local press, which doesn't exist anymore. You have these kind of levers of democracy that are there to kind of on that level, and the subsequent kind of governments after deindustrialization, they kind of thought you could replace that with identities created through like consumers consumption, basically, and it hasn't like filled that gap, that sense of meaning and stuff, just like buying stuff. While men, at the same time, men's status relative to women has also changed. So men have had to, it's a good thing. Men have had to adapt to the fact that part of their status cannot be derived anymore from being this like protector and provider for women. Women, we live in a free society, like, or at least that's the direction, or has been. And women want to they don't want to have to just hook up with the first guy who has a paycheck. You have to bring more to the table. You have to kind of figure out your identity, not just being kind of above somebody else. You have to kind of find that identity as something else. And I think it's become harder to do that in some ways. It's like what Richard Reeves talks about. What is the male identity now? Is it he talks about how it should be around fatherhood? Lean into that more. So I think it's really good, but then obviously that's not applicable to those who aren't fathers. So it's kind of a difficult conversation that isn't really being had very well in some space. Well, it's being had more now, but for a long time it wasn't really happening. It wasn't really happening outside of some of these like echo chambers of the internet that got very dark. They were talking about it for a long time, but some of the mainstream conversations, I don't know, quite confused. There's a lot of talk of role models, which on a micro level is like maybe more male teachers can be helpful. Maybe fathers taking like we talk about fatherlessness, but when fatherlessness is talked about in the manosphere and among some conservatives, they will talk about it as if it's women's fault for like choosing the wrong men, when it's most often, I would say, men for not taking responsibility and this kind of conversation. So these kind of unglamorous conversations, rather than just like role models to kind of slavishly follow on social media. I don't think that that's the solution, role models on social media, because the problem is in this manosphere area, you have too many people, too much gurudom. You have too many people saying that, oh, Jordan Peterson, I like what he says about this, so now I'm going to listen to him on the COVID vaccine or something. I mean, it's the old Christopher Hitchens quote. It should be about how you think, not what you think. We need to teach like media literacy, critical thinking, so that just because someone has clout and social proof on social media, just because someone has this kind of influencer status, and what I feel like we are programmed in some ways to respond to that. If someone has a big audience, it's like, well, there must be something there that we to listen to. We have this with, say, branded items. Why do we choose the Coca-Cola over the supermarket own brand if we know nothing about them? Well, all of these other people choose this one, so I'm going to choose this one because that it's like a shortcut. And the problem is with the influencer economy is that we kind of treat that we lost faith in institutions. That trust is going, but what's replaced it is this influencer dominated conversation where we lean into social proof, clout, and these things like tributes of likes and shares and all this stuff, and we don't necessarily interrogate. Someone's an expert in one area, we assume because they're on a 4-hour podcast talking about this stuff, they're an expert in this other area. And I think that type of gurudom is really bad, I think, for in general, and just kind of, we don't want role models like that. We want kind of just more prosaic, boring role models, people who step up, people who take responsibility for their community, people who give something like the left version of personal responsibility. Give something back. If you get someone pregnant, like, don't run off. Like, be a man, be a dad. And yeah, all this I could go on. It pisses me off basically, but because women get blamed for that stuff, those breakdowns, and yeah, that wasn't my experience when I was younger at all, and I know it's not the experience of many others.
No, I think it is, and I think that point is a really good one as well. It comes out of the sense of looking for gurus. You meet these characters constantly who, who've lost trust in mainstream, I mean, institutions, lost trust in the media. That classic kind of characterization, and then replace themselves. Like Andrew Tate being a dark example of this, who then replaced them. I am now. You can trust in me, and it feels like COVID maybe supercharged some of that too, but it was already there. And people on, like kind of a 4-hour podcast and everything. I know I might know something about this area, but extrapolating that out into lots of other stuff that frankly I have no experience of, and that spiral. I think the idea that I must say every time I hear the conversation about the left needs to create its own Joe Rogan, my eyes roll so far in my head that they kind of come back out the side background again. It feels like that is not the answer. Is to create another generation of gurus. It's about much more tangible political things, much more tangible and small scale at times, and often not about like an attempt to replace to kind of create a good version of Andrew Tate.
Yeah, and the problem is with the noise of social media is that whole ecosystem. Yeah, it kind of encourages a sort of grifter tendency, whether it's like wherever on the political spectrum. So you can see that some incarnation of left populism could be just like I don't really want that necessarily either, because I don't want kind of to have these celebrated like figures who we just kind of uncritically like adhere to their kind of politics or whatever, or to slavishly like devote ourselves to hang off every word, their every word and stuff. And the problem is the social media ecosystem rewards a certain that kind of behavior in some ways, or it has done on like Twitter in particular over like the last more than 10 years now. And so you have seen that's the technology shape, the McLuhan point about the technology, the medium, and the message is the message. That stuff has like really kind of shaped that dialectic between the technology and the type of politicians and individuals and influencers emerging. You can see that completely like molding that, where the people just coming to the fore in all these different spaces can be just these very narcissistic, sloganeering individuals who are it's sort of a grift, and not all of them, of course. I'm not saying that, but it doesn't really lend itself to like deeper thinking. Doesn't really lend itself to a more considered view of like your political opponents, because on their side, the people you see rising to the top are these kind of very extreme, unpleasant grifters. So a lot of it goes back to like technology, how we're just kind of swimming along the wave of these kind of technological decisions driven by the interests of oligarchs, and that shapes the politics like to a big extent. So we can talk all the time in moralistic language about individuals, but we're kind of on this wave of, and it feels more and more so, it's like all the time with the amount of time we spend on like devices now. We're kind of surfing this wave of Black Mirror-esque, this trajectory to cresting the wave, and we're not fully in control of the politics that emerges from that.
No, I think that's very true, and yeah, I think we I write a lot about this, an intersection of tech and oligarchy and the oligarchs, and a sense in which you write in the tech is a driving force throughout your book. I guess the one, and this kind of, it's not just an interesting. It's not just Twitter. It's not just places we might see. It's actually Instagram. It's other places. I think you get this real sense that lots of these social media platforms. I think we can get a bit like Twitter's the bad one. The other ones are all fine. Whereas actually this is happening
Yeah.
across platforms. It's not just about Elon Musk. Just one last question before you go. I guess on a kind of slightly more hopeful note, is there anything in the book? Is there anything that you come across that kind of signs of successful interventions or ways of doing things that kind of push back against some of these trends? You've spoken a bit about it already, but is there something that you want to single out?
No, it's all bad. No, there's definitely like there are definitely things. I didn't really write so much about that in the book because I didn't want to just tack that is its own like thing. That's its own like big essay, or I didn't want to just tack that on the end. It's about the Manosphere. They're not part of the Manosphere. So there's a lot of initiatives people do. I've spoken to Graham Golden, guy does initiative ex police does initiatives around like domestic violence and bystander, not kind of just standing by, whether it's in WhatsApp groups or in offline scenarios where there's kind of misogynistic language being like just kind of talking to your friends about it, like like it sounds like small fry or whatever, but kind of not standing for that stuff from your friends and things like that, and also having workshops where people who have held those beliefs before, misogynistic beliefs, say, can like really interrogate those things. I spoke to domestic violence groups which work with perpetrators as well, trying to kind of unpick where that desire for power over women, where that's kind of coming from, like what the ideology, the emotional like drivers for that. I mean, it's not a fool's errand. I think there's great value in that, and there's just loads of prosaic stuff I think which is happening, which is good on that lower level, which often gets overlooked with the debates around like adolescence and things like that. There are like interventions happening which are really good. Even some, I went to like a Jungian men's retreat as part of the research. It's not in the book because it didn't really fit. But that was like, again, I have my criticisms of the Jungian stuff, and you know that it's moved on since Iron John anyway. But it was quite good. It was like a bunch of guys getting together, talking about their emotions in ways that some of them hadn't done before, interrogating insecurities they have in relationships and in their relations with women or men or their sexuality, and just like for guys to get around to do that, even like someone like a like bougie kind of member of the media class or whatever like me, it was sort of like revelatory in some ways, like this is kind of a cool thing, and this is like there should be more stuff like this. I think that's very micro level. I mean, I find that more interesting in some ways than like the policy stuff is. Again, that's like Richard that's his bag, the policy stuff. I think he's quite an interesting person to talk about this stuff as well. But yeah, I think there is good stuff going on in that area, and the awareness. People are reading my book, so they know about the Manosphere, and just being alert to when you're being pushed through that sales funnel, being made to feel like shit and insecure, to make you more susceptible to that kind of programming, essentially the cult like programming, which then like sells you products and makes someone very wealthy. So like I think that message is getting through a bit more, that all that wealth you see behind you in those Instagram videos is not through some business genius. It's because you have this Piper like following paying them, basically.
I think that's a very, very good way to end this. Actually, be careful, be aware of when you've been sold to, and just in terms of like, if you've not seen it before, I'm from rural Ireland, and there's a thing called the men's sheds movement, which is quite big, especially in rural Ireland, which are like they started dotting up as spaces for men to go and spend time together. And by all accounts, I've not visited, but they seem to be very successful, and lots of people kind of use them and take advantage. And again, the kind of small scale interventions of places for people to go and meet and talk about things and have conversations.
Yeah, and it's kind of I don't know why, like I don't know, I haven't interrogated enough why I think it works necessarily, but there's some men won't say what they really think in front of women for what, you know, there's could be many reasons we could talk about why that is. They will keep in this shell, and often around other men as well, but where we were in this environment where it was accepted that, you know, all right, you don't want to speak now, I'll go first, and then I'll just kind of say something that like maybe I would feel insecure in another environment about talking. Like everyone's sharing, and it becomes this kind of very relatable thing. And I feel like the people there really did get like a lot out of it, and then kept up the conversation after with each other. And just I thought that was quite good. The guy who ran it was really good, and he was from Ireland as well, actually. A guy called Conor Craig.
Okay, interesting. Yeah, so it's probably, yeah. I think this there might be at least I can at least see a feature for you in like a feature, not a future, or maybe future too, in writing about
Back
some
into
of
that
that
stuff,
too.
yeah.
You know, um, James, thanks so much. I've really enjoyed this conversation. It's been really, really interesting. As I say, the book is great. I'm not just saying that it's a really, really interesting read. I really recommend it to people to read as well. And you know, thanks for your time. I hope people on the video have enjoyed it too. The entire video will be sent out. It'll probably be next week. I'll send a video out to everybody next week with a couple of other pieces to go alongside it. So if you've just joined or you've joined halfway through, you will get a chance to see the whole thing. But just want to say a huge thanks to everybody who's come on a kind of a very, at least here in London, a very, very balmy Friday afternoon. And yes, and I got one too. So yeah, mine's got more scribbles on it. But yeah, thank you very much for this, James. And yeah, I'm all the best with it. And everybody, thanks everyone who's joined the call.
Thanks
Take
for
care,
having me.
everybody. Take care, everybody. Bye.